This is the LatinNews Podcast. I am your host, Richard McCall, here in Bogota, Colombia, and our very special guest this week is Lucas Perelló. He is the assistant professor at the Department of Political Science at Florida Atlantic University, and we're discussing, the ongoing complications, or at least twists and turns, in the Honduran elections, and of course, what this means for Central America and indeed with foreign policy in the United States. So, Lucas, welcome on the LatinNews Podcast.
Thank you, Richard, for having me on the show. It's great to be here.
It is an incredibly timely episode, this one, because as we are recording, we still don't have an out-and-out winner in the elections. Now, the elections were held in Honduras on the 30th of November. And yes, we've seen that the National Party candidate, Nasry Asfura, is at 40.25 or 40.23%, and Salvador Nasralla of the LIBRE Party is at 39.48%. That's with about 90% of votes counted. It seems to be tipping towards Nasry Asfura. And of course, we have the LIBRE Party, that's the current party in power, President Xiomara Castro's party. Well, her candidate, Rixi Moncada, is at 19.27%. So perhaps, Lucas, we could just take a look at these elections and say, what is going on?
Well, that is true, right? We're seeing a very interesting election currently unfolding within Honduras. I think one of the biggest challenges that the entire world is witnessed by now is just how long it's taken to count the votes in the country. As you correctly pointed out, the election took place on November 30th, right? And at the time of this recording, we're still not entirely sure who is going to be the next president of the country.
But I mean, let's start with the very basics here. These candidates. Let's start with the LIBRE Party's candidate. I know it's an odd place to start, but it's the ruling party, Rixi Moncada. Why are they lost so badly? I mean, you'd expect the ruling party to do okay.
Absolutely. I think it is a shock to see just the poor performance of LIBRE, the incumbent political party in Honduras, especially when you compare it to the election result of 2021, when Xiomara Castro won the presidency with an absolute majority, with 51% of votes. Now, I think there's two big reasons that explain why is it that LIBRE underperformed so badly. The first one has to do with the unpopular government. The presidency of Xiomara Castro and her government have really lost touch with voters. And voters, as a response to this, turned their backs and actually punished the political party at the polls last November 30th. If we know anything for certain at this point, is that the ruling party lost by a landslide. Now, why is it that this happened? I'd say that there are various aspects concerning the sitting presidency. The first one, very clearly, is that Xiomara Castro and her government failed to deliver on key campaign promises. They had promised to implement a progressive tax reform, which was never materialized. They also had promised, and they had actively advocated in favor of reaching an agreement with the United Nations for an international commission, anti-corruption commission, to make landfall in the country. But her administration is coming to an end, and that is nowhere near becoming a reality. Another front that is important has to do with crime and the perception of insecurity. In the first year of her presidency, in late 2022, President Xiomara Castro tried to replicate the hard-on crime policies adopted by Nayib Bukele, in neighboring El Salvador. Now, what she did was to declare a war against extortion. This was a war on extortion that actually targeted gangs in the country, the Maras, which are still very powerful. Now, to her credit, the homicide rate in Honduras has fallen over these last couple of years. But nonetheless, the perception of insecurity in the country remains widespread. And there is no concrete evidence that I've seen that actually signals that extortion rates have actually decreased in the country. And then there's one of the biggest features here, which is the narco video that was released last year. What basically happened here is that for over a decade, Xiomara Castro and the ruling LIBRE Party had presented themselves in the eyes of Hondurans as being these champions that were fighting against the narco dictadura, or the narco dictatorship led by Juan Orlando Hernández and the National Party, which were in power from 2010 to 2022, Hernández more specifically from 2014 to 2022. So they've always presented themselves as these champions that, if elected, if they were given the possibility to govern the country, that they would really try to root out drug trafficking and its influence in politics.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what happened last year was that there was this video published. It was a secretly recorded video of 2013 that showed none other than the brother-in-law of Xiomara Castro, Carlos Zelaya, who's the brother of Manuel Zelaya, the former president of the country, talking with these famous drug traffickers in Honduras and negotiating campaign contributions with them, and very clearly stating that half of those campaign contributions would go to the Comandante, which is a famous nickname for Manuel Zelaya. Now, that completely destroyed, I would say, the credentials that LIBRE and Xiomara Castro had really built when it came to these efforts at fighting drug trafficking and its influence within the country. So there's those three big areas. But another point that I like to emphasize has to do with the candidates of the ruling party, Rixi Moncada. Rixi Moncada is very uncharismatic. I would say that if you compare Rixi Moncada to other candidates, especially those in the opposition, Nasry Asfura and Salvador Nasralla, Rixi Moncada doesn't come close to their charisma and her ability to actually connect with voters. The only reason why Rixi Moncada is the candidate of the ruling party is because she is a loyalist to the Zelaya family, right? To Manuel Zelaya and also to Xiomara Castro. That's why she won the primary in March by such a landslide. But as a candidate, she isn't, or she proved to not actually be good on the campaign trail. If you listen to her message throughout these last months, she was more or less replicating or echoing the message of the government. So she wasn't able to take full distance from what was already an unpopular government. And in the messaging that she provided, it was a message that was always focusing primarily on the past, on the 2009 coup, in the months that were taken away from Manuel Zelaya's presidency, and their struggles as an opposition political party that challenged the national party rule. It wasn't a message about the future. It wasn't a message about hope. It was a message that was still quite stuck in the past. So when you think about all these features put together, the unpopular governments and this uncharismatic candidates, it becomes clearer, at least to me, why is it that she performed so poorly? I mean, when you look at the electoral map of Honduras right now, LIBRE, which in 2021 won with 51% of votes, is currently in third place with approximately 20% of votes. They didn't win a single departamento in Honduras, which are like the states in the US. And even Rixi Moncada lost in her own municipality of Talanga. She wasn't able to end up in first place there. So this has been a landslide defeat by any metric that has punished the ruling left-wing LIBRE Party.
It's absolutely fascinating. The LIBRE Party, suffering from a major lack of credibility, not having been able to pursue or follow up on their campaign promises, and then, of course, an incredibly uncharismatic candidate. So it doesn't seem like they organized this very well. And let's put this into the context of Honduras as a whole in the current political situation. We have serious political polarization, which tends to be the norm right now anyway. There is fear, of course, and anxiety from previous electoral fraud cases. Hondurans are screaming out for economic opportunities. I mean, this is what whoever gets in power will be needing to look at this. Declining migration, declining remittances for Honduras as well. And of course, this recent, what would you say, lifting pardon of former President Juan Orlando Hernández. I mean, it is a very complex situation that we're facing.
Oh, absolutely. I'd say that there are already structural factors that were making or were shaping this to be one of the most, challenging elections that Honduras has experienced since it transitioned to democracy in the early 1980s. You have, on the one hand, all these economic components to it. This economic situation in the country, the lack of economic opportunities for people, the hits that remittances are very likely going to continue taking in the country, as there's been this what's based on the policies that the Trump administration has been adopting in the United States. We have to remember that almost 1 million Hondurans live in the United States, and the remittances account for a quarter, more or less, of the country's GDP. So the economic outlook already isn't very promising in the country. In addition to that, you also have these high levels of polarization, high levels of, I would say, especially ideological polarization in the country. That's something absolutely fascinating. And for many, many years, Honduras was what you would label as a very, how to say this, maybe as a boring country, right? Because it was so predictable, and because the elections, the two main political parties were just so similar to each other. But now in this particular election, you see that polarization levels are extremely high, and that when you have high levels of polarization, that is usually a big risk and a challenge for democracy. And then you have these surprises that have also been occurring within the country. The pardoning, for example, of former President Juan Orlando Hernández days before the election of November 30th. That was a huge surprise that no one was expecting, which in my opinion really upended the race and really boosted the chances of one candidate, particularly the National Party candidate, Nasry Asfura.
Why is this then? I mean, you'd think that an international, is it scandalous that former President Juan Orlando Hernández was sentenced? He had a 45-year sentence for sending, 400 tons of cocaine, or being associated with sending 400 tons of cocaine to the United States. He's been pardoned. You'd think that his party might suffer on this account.
Well, to be honest, the effect that this had on the election wasn't the one that I had initially anticipated. When the pardon took place, and this was the Thursday or the Friday before the election of November 30th, right? My overall impression was that, there were a couple of tweets that came out, and then the official pardon. My impression is that had a good chance of actually hurting Nasry Asfura and the prospects of the National Party in winning the election. But what actually happened was completely the opposite. It boosted his campaign and the chances of winning the presidency, which simply confirms the outsized influence that the United States has in the country.
Yeah.
We have to remember what I previously mentioned, that approximately 1 million Hondurans live in the United States. The remittances are an economic lifeline for the country. During these last 4 years, we've seen a lot of antagonism between the Honduran government led by Xiomara Castro, which has had a series of confrontations with the U.S. diplomats within Honduras. At one point, she actually threatened to pull the plug on the extradition agreement with the United States. And that hasn't contributed for there to be the best diplomatic relations between Honduras and the United States. In fact, I'd say that these have actually reached a low point between both countries. Now, Hondurans are aware of this. They've been following what's been happening. And what Hondurans clearly prefer is good relations between the U.S. and Honduras. There's so many economic ties between both countries. There's so many family ties between both countries. What you would expect the government is actually try to make the diplomatic relations to be as best as possible, not actually be a source of confrontation. So when Donald Trump announces on X, formerly Twitter, that he is endorsing Nasry Asfura, the former mayor of Tegucigalpa, I think that had a big impact on voters. Essentially, it said that if we want to have better diplomatic relations with the United States, if we want to preserve these economic lifelines that exist toward the country, then we need to vote for this particular candidate and this political party. So, yeah, it completely upended the race based on what I was initially expecting.
And of course, Trump has famously said he's not going to throw good money after bad. in terms of aid towards Honduras. Is Honduras a country that's receiving the repatriation flights? Is it a country that has agreed to this within Central America?
It has. I would have to check more into it, but in the past, Honduras did play a role in that, certainly.
Okay, so, but I mean, it is fascinating that this should be the way, but it seems that Hondurans themselves are obviously, with 1 million Hondurans, and Honduras obviously with a small population, 1 million Hondurans living in the United States, everyone would prefer a pragmatic working relationship, it seems.
Exactly.
That we depend on this. And how do we then, I mean, was it today or yesterday when then Honduras had the Attorney General has, issued an arrest warrant for former President Orlando Hernández due to the corruption accusations stemming back to the Pandora 2 anti-corruption investigation. How is this going to play out, Lucas?
Well, I mean, I think there's two different ways to view this. The first one is to revisit who Juan Orlando Hernández was as president of the country. And then it would be to think about what are the possible implications of him returning to the country, especially within this political climate. Now, Juan Orlando Hernández was a lawmaker initially. He quickly rose up the ranks of the National Party. He became president of Congress between 2010 to 2014. And in the election of 2013, he wins the presidential nomination of the National Party and ultimately the presidency by a plurality. Now, his administration was a very controversial administration. Yes, it was much more closely aligned with U.S. geopolitical interests during those years. And the U.S. did see in Hernández an ally, right? But domestically, there were many things that he did that were actually quite harmful for Honduras. And there's different aspects in which we can see this. One of them would be how corruption flourished under his administration. I mean, he himself admitted at one point that his party had embezzled funds from the institution in charge of the country's welfare programs to an extent, right? But that it wouldn't be an issue because the party would pay back those funds, right? And there were a series of other corruption scandals that actually grew, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic when it came to buying aid, right? Then there was also what happened in terms of the growing influence of drug trafficking and drug traffickers in Honduras. Now, drug traffickers have had an influence on Honduran politics for a long time now. This certainly did precede Hernández. But what actually occurred under Hernández is that those relations were, to an extent, exacerbated. They actually grew. Under Hernández, especially based on the trial that we saw, there's all these allegations in which the Guzman donated $1 million to his campaign. We know that, and based on another trial of that of his younger brother, Doña Hernández, that Doña Hernández would brand the cocaine shipment with his initials, TH, Doña Hernández, that would go through the country. We are based on what we heard from the trial that took place in New York, when Orlando Hernández contributed or played a role in getting approximately 400 tons of cocaine into the United States that would go up the noses of the gringos, right? We know all this based on the trial. So what happened under Hernández is that Honduras gained the status, this fame, right? An unwanted one, by the way, of becoming a narco state. So when it comes to, corruption, when it comes to drug trafficking, the record of Hernández was actually quite bad. And I'm not even mentioning the damage that his administration did to democracy in the country. Under Hernández, Honduras experienced a process of democratic backsliding. Hernández had this knack, or there was some irregularities occurred when it came to allowing him to run for presidential re-election, which was strictly prohibited by the Constitution, but he still did that in 2017. And let's not forget the crisis of the 2017 election, in which there were irregularities. I was in the country when this happened, and I could tell you that there was evidence of irregularities all around, right? In which he was eventually able to win the presidency by a margin of 50,000 votes. So it's important to keep in mind who Hernández is and what he did in Honduras during his tenure as president. Now, moving forward, what could ultimately happen, I think, there's different scenarios that you can certainly envision here. One of them is that I don't think Hernandez is going to return to the country until the National Party actually secures the presidency, until perhaps after January 27th next year, in which we could expect that Nasry Asfura might become the next president of the country based on the vote tallies that we have up till this point. Now, I'm curious about what's going to happen afterwards. If the current Attorney General will remain in his post, the current Attorney General, Joel Zelaya, is very close, and he's acted like a loyalist to the government. So I wonder to what point he will actually remain in his position. And I also do wonder whether Nasry Asfura, who is looking like he will be the next president of Honduras, actually wants Hernandez back in the country. Right? And Nasry Asfura was the successor of Hernandez in the 2021 election. But for many years, he's been trying to take certain distance of Hernandez and his legacy, especially because of all these controversies surrounding his involvement with drug trafficking, right? And now Hernandez might actually come back. So it's clearly setting the stage for an interesting moment in Honduran politics if Hernandez were to return in the near future to the country.
It seems so unreasonable, and obviously, well, part of the way that I've put this podcast together, but it seems so unreasonable that we should be speaking so much about Orlando Hernández and not the actual election in hand. He's such an outsized figure. You could see, and we could suggest, obviously, that the Zelaya, the Attorney General, may not be in his position by the 27th of January at the inauguration of, let's say, if it's President Nasry Asfura, we could say you could suggest that perhaps he's not in that position, and therefore Orlando Hernández receives a pardon or something of some sort, or something goes away. But you could also see that Nasry Asfura as president would say, okay, let's lift we can give you a pardon, but don't come back. It's like you can see some sort of play going on there. It seems to me that this election is incredibly transactional at the way it's going at the moment. But let's talk about it, the actual details as we have them now. So Salvador Nasralla,
yes.
Nasralla, he has run several times, and of course it looks like he's going to be unsuccessful this time around. He's already calling fraud. He's already calling that there's irregularities. There's something like a difference of 35,000 votes, and I've seen that Rixi Moncada has been calling fraud and that they won't recognize the outcomes, and is calling for a complete recount of some sort. And I've seen that Xiomara Castro has called for the Extraordinary Assembly for National Dignity on the 13th of December. Is this a protest march? What is this National Dignity Assembly? I have heard nothing else about it.
Well, what you basically have here is that there's a very contested election in which the institution in charge of counting the votes, the Consejo Nacional Electoral, hasn't done a good job. It's such a shame to see this actually happening in Honduras. This is a country that since 2013, 2017, 2021, right, has had significant problems when it comes to counting votes and actually transmitting those votes and inspiring confidence in elections. There are big problems when it comes to the integrity of elections within the country. Now, what essentially is happening right now is that the losing parties, Nasralla on the one hand, and also the government on the other, are crying foul play, as you would have expected them to do so. Now, in the case of the government, they've really adopted a very tough position, right? What we know is that if there's any certainty about these election results, is that the government lost by a landslide, right? But in the presidential election, they're close to 20% of votes, which is a significant drop compared to what they received in 2021. But even the government isn't conceding defeats. What the government has basically been doing through different spokespeople, right, from the former president, Manuel Zelaya, to the current president, Xiomara Castro, to the candidate, Rixi Moncada, they're all calling that there was fraud in the election. You have a close ally of the government, Luis Redondo, who is the president of Congress, who, by the way, was not re-elected to a seat, which shows just how unpopular the government really is, saying that this is the electoral framework of drug traffickers of sorts, right? So they're really, although they played a huge role in overseeing the election and guaranteeing that the election took place, they're actually denouncing the results, alleging that there's fraud, and they're not conceding defeats. Now, the other player who is also doing this is Salvador Nasralla. And Salvador Nasralla has a history of trying to win the presidency. This is his fourth presidential bid. The first one was back in 2013. He tried so again 2017. In 2021, he came very close, but he withdrew his candidacy to support Xiomara Castro. And now in 2025, he's running again for the presidency. In 2017, there were these alleged widespread irregularities when it came to counting votes in Honduras. And that election was snatched from Nasralla, right? It's very likely that he actually won that election. But he ended up losing, per the official vote count, by approximately 50,000 votes. So he's basically, what he's saying now is that when he was winning, and there was several days in which he was the front runner in the vote counts, he was saying that everything was okay. And now that he's losing by approximately 30,000 votes, he's crying that there is foul play. And that makes it very difficult for the future of Honduras, or whoever becomes the next president. Now, what the government is doing right now, and Nasralla is doing this, but on the side of the LIBRE Party, where he is the standard bearer of that party, is that, again, the government is not conceding defeat, it's not recognizing this, it's trying to mobilize its members, its affiliates, right, its partisans, to go to the streets, to talk about, to discuss these results, and to serve as an act of resistance, in their view, to the fraud that is, in their view, taking place at the moment. So they're taking this really tough approach, this approach to not conceding to the defeats. Now, and that's part of the call that you just referenced. It's part of a strategy seeking to an extent, boycott the election results within the country. And you can expect that Nasralla and the liberals will very likely do something similar if, when we reach 99.9% of votes, it's been by percentage points that the votes have been released, right? If ultimately the results confirm that Nasry Asfura wins the presidency, he's going to try to use very similar tactics. Now, and what can happen in the future? We know that Honduras needs to have a new president by January 27th next year, right? Yeah. Now, if the past is a good indicator of how things might unfold now, what will very likely happen is that there's going to be a recount of the votes. Now, the scope of this is still unclear. It could be in certain municipalities, in certain departments, right, in which this takes place. And here I'm thinking about what unfolded in the wake of the 2017 election, in which there was these irregularities that unfolded. And we'll see what comes from that. But to have an entirely new votes, as the government is currently stating, it's going to be more difficult to actually achieve that outcome.
I just see it as incredibly complex in this situation. And what is Asfura saying regarding this? And how is he responding to the accusations of fraud in this from the CNE and the counting process?
Well, Asfura is doing what you could expect a winning candidate to be doing at this moment. I think he is open to, or his political party is open to revisiting how votes took place in certain municipalities. Just on Sunday, for example, they had to redo the vote in one particular municipality in Honduras because they detected big irregularities in it. So they did another vote in that one municipality. But I am skeptical about him coming out to say, yes, we need to revisit the election entirely, especially because he wants to be the next president of the country.
It's also, it seems so close. He wouldn't want it to come back. Very possibly another 35,000 votes can be found somewhere. Stranger things have happened. I'm sort of thinking of other situations, well, actually in North America, Mexico, when I think it was Lopez Obrador lost an election and essentially set up a parallel government there in the Zócalo itself. Is there a possibility of Nasralla trying to do something like that, saying, we don't recognize this, you guys, we're going to do our own parallel government?
I think there is. So this was, if I recall correctly, the 2006 election in Mexico, in which
way back, but I'm
way back, yeah. I think that Nasralla is, he is, I would define him as being this firebrand candidate. He is certainly capable of trying to be sworn in as as a president of Honduras, although he isn't officially recognized by the electoral body as such. So imagine that the vote actually confirms that Nasry Asfura wins the presidency, and he is sworn in as president on January 27th next year. Nasralla will continue to cry foul play. That is, in my opinion, what he will likely do. Now, the extent to which he and the Liberal Party will remain together, I think, is an open question. Nasralla is someone who has created political parties, who has done a series of alliances with the ideological left, right, with LIBRE, with the ideological right, as a member of the opposition to LIBRE since 2022. And he might very likely try a strategy and a tactic like that. But ultimately, I don't think it will be successful. It didn't even work out for AMLO, and he was capable of mobilizing people to an extent that Nasralla only would wish to be able to do, right? So he might try a strategy like that, and he'll go to international forums and cry that there was foul play. But in the end, the person who's going to be likely ruling the country is Nasry Asfura and the National Party.
Well, then let's look ahead. Let's look ahead to this. What can we expect for a government of a future president, let's say, potential future president, Nasry Asfura? I imagine that he would continue let's say, a mano dura, the strong rule of law to try and emulate, as we've mentioned him before, Nayib Bukele in El Salvador, because the public perception of insecurity is of one of concern. What can we expect for a government under the National Party?
So I think there's a couple of concrete steps that the next government will take, again, if Nasry Asfura were the next president. The first one is that, just like politicians across Latin America are finding out, the policies adopted by Nayib Bukele in El Salvador are popular in the eyes of voters. So I wouldn't be surprised if Nasry Asfura would actually try to pursue similar policies, cracking down on gangs, trying to reduce the overall crime rate in the country, continue this trend in which there's been a decrease of homicides within the country, amongst other points. No government, especially a right-wing government like him, would like to be seen as being soft on crime. So he's very likely going to continue in that particular direction, right? Trying to crack down on crime to the extent that it is possible. Then the second point that I think is going to be very important for him is going to be to amend relations with the United States. We know that diplomatic relations, again, between Honduras and the United States have reached an all-time low since perhaps when the country transitioned to democracy in the early 1980s. I mean, it's not good at the moment between both sides. So I think that what Nasry Asfura would very likely try to do is to try to reconnect diplomatically with the United States, and by adopting policies that are more in line with the U.S. worldview at the moment. Let's remember that in the last 4 years, Xiomara Castro has used international forums to support, I want to emphasize, to support dictatorships in Cuba, in Venezuela, and in Nicaragua. This is it's very far from the policies and the official line, right, of the U.S. government. So I think that Nasry Asfura will try to reconnect there. And basically, what the U.S. has said, if you read the tweets by Donald Trump, is that Nasry Asfura is their preferred candidate. So very likely will continue to amend those relations. And then the third point, I think, is that you can expect more of these business-friendly, pro-market policies that have been so common under the National Party. One of the biggest shortcomings of Castro's government was that they tried to pass a new tax reform, which was viewed as a more progressive tax reform, the Ley de Justicia Tributaria. Now, if you follow what Nasry Asfura has actually said, he's actually said that he's against a tax reform in the country. He says that when he was mayor of Tegucigalpa, which was roughly from 2014 to 2022, that he didn't need a tax reform in order to, get revenue for the municipal government to actually work. So I think he's going to try to continue catering to the big business groups and also catering to within the country, but also trying to extend more of an invitation for foreign investment to the country, which has been more or less what Nayib Bukele has also tried to do within El Salvador. So what you can expect is that there's going to be a different change in the discourse toward private business groups, especially those that are interested in investing within Honduras. One that has been very hostile under the government of Libre and Xiomara Castro. You can expect that there's going to be a shift in the tone coming from Nasry Asfura.
Fascinating to see this. I mean, fascinating that this is, the way that this is all sort of, let's say, panning out for the country. I mean, I see security obviously being a huge issue. I assume that with Nasry Asfura in power, then there'll be Honduran support, government support for the U.S. military in the Southern Caribbean and this area, of course, combating, as they say, is drugs boats. Obviously, Honduras being a major transshipment route for cocaine from Colombia going up to the United States. But then, of course, it all comes back to Juan Orlando Hernández, because what does Trump get from releasing someone who was found guilty of drug trafficking with all of this different policy? I have to ask that.
It is. Let me just say it this way. It was a huge surprise, right? Now, that being said, there were signs along the way, right? We know that the former president's family of Juan Orlando Hernández has been trying to advocate, right, for his release from a U.S. federal prison, for him to get a sort of pardon for some time now. This has been a campaign that has been led specifically by the former First Lady, his wife, and his daughters. So they've always been trying to do this. In fact, the former First Lady of Ana Carillas, right? She actually ran for the primary in this year's to become the standard bearer of the National Party in the election, and she actually received a sizable amount of votes, right? Which really says that the Hernandez sector of the National Party is still strong, right? Now, what happens before the election about this? When it comes to the pardon, it sent shockwaves throughout the country, and it really upended the election. Before the election, more or less, my outview of it was that the government was going to perform poorly, and that Nasry Asfura didn't have a good chance, and that the candidate who would actually win was Salvador Nasralla. Now, the U.S. endorsements of Asfura and pardoning Hernández, and basically saying that if you want to have good diplomatic relations with us, then you need to elect Nasry Asfura, completely changed the race. And this was essentially overnight. Now, there's so many features about this that have come as a huge surprise. But perhaps one of the biggest ones is just how this contradicts so much of what the Trump administration is doing within the Caribbean and South America right now. We have seen the president denounce the president of Colombia, for example, right? Those two have antagonized each other for a long time now. We are also seeing that the United States is threatening with perhaps, right, military strikes within Venezuelan territory, calling their dictatorship a narco-dictatorship, that Nicolás Maduro and his allies are in charge of this cartel de los soles, and that they are responsible for smuggling drugs to the United States. I want to emphasize those points just to stress again just what a contradiction it is to have pardoned Juan Orlando Hernández, who was sentenced to a 45-year prison sentence by a U.S. jury and a U.S. judge for his participation in helping smuggle, approximately 400 tons of cocaine to the United States, amongst other offenses too. So when it comes to it, I'm sure we're going to find more answers in the near future about what was happening here. But for me, it just really reveals the transactional approach that exists coming from the administration's foreign policy, right? There is a transactional approach. And in addition to that, I'd also say that Hernandez is ideologically much closer, right, to the United States, especially the current administration.
Yeah.
They worked together as partners in the past, right? And Juan Orlando Hernández was able to secure re-election amidst these big irregularities in 2017 because he had the implicit support of the United States, right? So I think it's because of this transactional approach and also the closeness that exists between who Juan Orlando Hernández is, what his political party represents, and the current worldview, right, and the platform of the administration right now in the United States.
Is this, this, I don't know if we would call it interference in the election, but I mean, obviously those with a more liberal bent will say, wow, this the specter of yesteryear, the 1980s, the CIA, everything else. And then, of course, those on the right, saying, well, it's for the greater good. And it creates this situation of real uncertainty because, the contradiction of a transactional approach. It makes it incredibly fascinating to watch. Of course, a concern for Honduras. The Trump administration is anything if not, well, it's predictable and unpredictable when it comes to these things, because if Nasry Asfura does not toe the line as he's supposed to, then what can we expect from let's say the secretary, Marco Rubio and so on, and the connections to Miami there and beyond. It is a fascinating time to be watching Honduras. One wishes that there was more reporting out there to inform us, but let me take this time to say thank you, Lucas, for giving us your quite profound insights into what is taking place. It has been a hard episode to record, given the fact that the final results are not actually in, even though it looks like Nasry Asfura will be the next president or is likely to become the next president of Honduras. Of course, the Consejo Nacional Electoral in Honduras, the National Electoral Council, has until the 30th of December to declare a winner according to the law. And then the inauguration of any new president will be the 27th of January next year when they take office. So there's still time for things to move around and change. It could shift some way or another. One hopes that for the best of people on Honduras that this is peaceful. Of course, we know that there were 16 deaths in electoral violence previously, and we don't want to see that again. But Lucas Perelló, thank you so much for your time. Lucas is the assistant professor of the Department of Political Science at the Florida Atlantic University. It has been fascinating to discuss this with you.
Thanks so much for having me on the show, Richard.
It has been an absolute pleasure. My name is Richard McCall. I've been your host here from Bogota, Colombia for the LatinNews Podcast. Remember to subscribe and, of course, share these episodes. Every fortnight, we bring a new episode of something from the region of importance out there to you. Thank you again for listening, and goodbye.